My name is Alina, and I'm 29 years old. 7 years ago, my father stood in the doorway of my childhood home and said 6 words that shattered everything I thought I knew about unconditional love. We only have one daughter now. No explanation, no hesitation, just a deadbolt sliding shut on 22 years of trying to be good enough. I spent that night shivering on a cold metal bench at a bus station, clutching a garbage bag of clothes, while my sister slept soundly in the warm room that used to be mine. I had no idea that the elderly couple who bought me a coffee the next morning, total strangers, would become the family I had always prayed for. I had no idea that 7 years later, my biological father would show up uninvited to my wedding in a tuxedo, expecting to walk me down the aisle, only to stand there watching in shock as I introduced the man who actually earned that privilege. Before I tell you what happened when he tried to take my arm, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you. And let me know in the comments, have you ever had to choose yourself over your family? Let me take you back to the night the rain started falling. In the architecture of my childhood home, my sister Bianca was the spire, ornamental, celebrated, reaching for the sky. I was the load-bearing wall. Nobody looked at me, nobody applauded me, but if I cracked, the whole house would come down. I learned early on that love in our family wasn't given, it was purchased. Bianca purchased it with beauty pageants and charm, with the way she could smile and make my father, Walter, feel like a king. I purchased it with utility. I was the one who fixed the Wi-Fi, the one who remembered birthdays, and as I got older, the one who opened her wallet. By 22, I was working 2 jobs, one as a barista, one as a junior drafter, while Bianca was finding herself in Europe on my parents' credit card. I drove a 10-year-old sedan that rattled when it hit 40 miles per hour. Bianca drove a leased convertible that cost more than my annual tuition. I didn't resent her for the luxury, I resented her for the immunity. No matter what she broke, I was expected to bring the broom. But this time, the broom wasn't enough. I had just come home from a double shift, my feet throbbing, clutching a bank receipt in my pocket. It was a receipt for my freedom fund, $15,000 I had scraped together over 4 years. It was enough for a deposit on a small studio apartment and my final semester of tuition. I was going to move out in 2 weeks. When I walked into the kitchen, the air was so thick with tension I could taste the metal. Bianca was sobbing at the kitchen table, her face buried in her hands. My mother was rubbing her back, whispering soothing nonsense, while Walter paced the linoleum floor like a caged tiger. "What happened?" I asked, dropping my keys. Walter stopped packing and looked at me. There was no warmth in his eyes, only calculation. "Your sister had an accident." My stomach dropped. "Is she hurt?" "She's fine," Walter snapped, dismissing my concern as an annoyance. "The car is totaled, and the other driver's car is a write-off." I looked at Bianca. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "The insurance lapsed, Alina," Walter said, his voice dangerously calm. "She forgot to pay the premium last month. The other driver is threatening to sue for damages if we don't settle out of court immediately. We need $20,000 by Friday." I did the math instantly. "I don't have $20,000, Dad." "We have 5, he said. "You have 15. The silence that followed was deafening. He didn't ask. He didn't plead. He stated it as a fact, as if my bank account was simply an extension of his own, a reserve tank for Bianca's mistakes. "No," I whispered. Walter blinked, as if I had spoken in a foreign language. "Excuse me." "That money is for my apartment. It's for my degree," I said, my voice shaking but my feet planted. "I have been saving every penny since I was 18. Bianca drove a car she couldn't afford and didn't pay the insurance. That's not my debt." Bianca let out a fresh wail, a high-pitched sound that usually made my father melt. This time, it made him harden into stone. "Family helps family," Walter growled, stepping into my personal space. He loomed over me, using his height to intimidate, a tactic that had worked for 20 years. "Your sister is in trouble. You are the only one who can fix it. You will go to the bank tomorrow and you will withdraw that money." "I won't," I said. I'm done paying for her life, Dad. I'm trying to start my own. You selfish girl, my mother hissed from the table, speaking for the first time. After everything we've done for you. What have you done for me? I asked, the tears finally stinging my eyes. Except ask me to clean up after her. I'm not doing it, not this time. Walter's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. He pointed a shaking finger at the door. If you think you can hoard your money while your sister's future is destroyed, then you don't know what it means to be a daughter of this house. I guess I don't, I said. If you don't pay, Walter said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, then you don't stay. You choose that money over your blood, you leave. Tonight. I didn't wait for him to count to 3. I didn't beg, and I certainly didn't apologize. For the first time in my life, the fear of his anger was outweighed by the sheer exhaustion of trying to please him. I turned on my heel and marched to my bedroom, grabbing a black garbage bag from the bottom of my closet. I didn't have time to pack a suitcase. Walter was already hovering in the hallway, checking his watch like I was a tenant who had overstayed a lease. I threw in my work uniform, 2 pairs of jeans, a heavy sweater, and my laptop. I swept my toiletries into the bag with a clatter. When I walked back to the living room, bag slung over my shoulder, the silence was absolute. Bianca was still at the table, but she had stopped crying. She was scrolling on her phone now, the crisis apparently paused while I took the fall. My mother refused to look up from her hands, her knuckles white as she gripped a tea towel. She was choosing her survival over mine, just as she always had. Walter opened the front door. The rain I had smelled earlier was coming down in sheets now, turning the porch into a slick gray mirror. I stepped onto the threshold and turned back, just for a second. I wanted to see if there was any regret in his eyes, any flicker of the father who used to push me on the tire swing when I was 5. There was nothing but cold, hard resolve. Don't bother knocking when you realize you can't make it on your own, he said, his voice flat and final. He looked past me, staring into the wet darkness of the street. We only have one daughter now. The door slammed shut before I could even exhale. Then came the sound that would replay in my nightmares for years, the heavy, metallic thud click of the deadbolt sliding home. I stood on the porch for a long minute, the rain soaking through my thin blouse, plastering my hair to my neck. I was waiting for the door to open. I was waiting for my mother to run out, for Bianca to confess she had money of her own, for Dad to say he was just trying to scare me. But the porch light flickered and went out. They had already moved on. I walked. I didn't know where else to go. The suburbs of our town were quiet, the windows of other houses glowing with the warm, yellow light of televisions and family dinners. Every lit window felt like an accusation. I walked 3 miles to the downtown bus station. It was the only place I knew that would be unlocked and dry at midnight. The air inside smelled of diesel fumes, floor wax, and stale desperation. I found a metal bench in the far corner, away from the few other stragglers who looked like they had been living in these plastic chairs for weeks. I pulled my knees to my chest, hugging the garbage bag like a lifeline. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip my jacket. I reached into my pocket and pulled out everything I had on me. $3 bills, a quarter, 2 dimes and a handful of warm pennies. $3.48. I had $15,000 in a bank draft tucked into my notebook, but until the bank opened in the morning, it was just a piece of paper. It couldn't buy me a sandwich. It couldn't buy me a bed. In that moment, surrounded by the hum of vending machines I couldn't afford to use, the abstract concept of savings meant nothing. I was homeless. The word felt heavy and foreign, like a stone in my throat. I rested my head against the cold cinderblock wall and watched the second hand on the wall clock tick by, each second stretching out into an eternity. It was going to be a very long night. The sun rose gray and indifferent, filtering through the grime of the bus station windows. My bones ached from the hard plastic bench, and my mouth tasted like anxiety, metallic and dry. I waited until the station manager started eyeing the sleeping stragglers with a broom before I grabbed my bag and walked out. I needed somewhere to sit that wasn't a sidewalk. I needed heat. I found a diner 3 blocks away, the kind with cracked vinyl seats and windows steamed up from the grill. I walked in, the bell above the door announcing my shame to the room. I kept my head down, sliding into a small booth in the back corner. When the waitress came over, pad in hand, I was already arranging my coins on the laminate table. 3 crumbled dollar bills, 48 cents in silver and copper. A cup of coffee was $2.50. A bagel was $4. "Just water, please," I whispered. "And maybe hot water, with lemon if it's free." The waitress popped her gum, her eyes flicking to the garbage bag next to me. She knew. In this part of town, everyone knew. Water's free, lemon's 50 cents. "Just the water, then." She walked away, and I pulled my hands into my sleeves, trying to stop shivering. I stared at the coins, moving them into little stacks. This was it. This was my net worth until the bank opened at 9, and even then I'd have to wait for the funds to clear. The hunger in my stomach was a sharp, physical pain, twisting like a wet rag. "Excuse me, miss." I flinched, my hand instinctively covering my small pile of money. Standing next to my booth was a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a storybook. She had clouds of silver hair and wore a coat that looked soft enough to sleep in. Beside her stood a man in a tweed cap, holding a cane. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said, her voice warm and devoid of the suspicion I had grown used to in the last 12 hours. "But my husband, Arthur, is terrible at ordering. He asked for the breakfast special and a side of blueberry muffins, and there is simply no way we can finish it all." I looked at them confused. "Oh. We hate to see good food go to waste," Arthur said, his eyes twinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses. "And Martha here won't let me eat the muffin, says it's bad for my cholesterol. Would you do us a kindness and help us out?" It was a lie, a beautiful, transparent lie. They hadn't even ordered yet. Their table across the aisle was empty. But they weren't offering me charity. They were offering me a favor. They were letting me keep my dignity. I can't pay you," I stammered, glancing at my pathetic stack of coins. "Nonsense," Martha said. "You're doing us a favor. Please join us. The booth is much more comfortable." I grabbed my garbage bag and followed them. When the food arrived, eggs, bacon, toast, and a muffin the size of a softball, I had to physically restrain myself from inhaling it. I took small, careful bites, terrified that if I ate too fast, I would cry. Arthur poured me a cup of coffee from their carafe, pushing the cream and sugar toward me without a word. "I'm Martha," the woman said, buttering her toast, "and this is Arthur." "Elena," I said, my voice raspy. "It's nice to meet you, Elena," Arthur said. He didn't look at my dirty clothes. He didn't look at the garbage bag. He looked me in the eye. "You look like you've had a long night." "The longest," I admitted, wrapping my hands around the hot mug. "Well," Martha said softly, "you're safe here for a little while. Eat up. There's no rush." For the first time since my father locked the door, my shoulders dropped. I wasn't just a problem to be solved or a nuisance to be removed. I was a person having breakfast, and for that hour, that was enough to keep me alive. By the time we left the diner, the gray sky had turned a bruised purple, and the clouds burst open. It wasn't just rain, it was a deluge, the kind that floods gutters and turns sidewalks into rivers. I stood under the diner's awning, clutching my garbage bag, preparing to make a run for the library. "Absolutely not," Martha said, opening a large umbrella that seemed to swallow her small frame. "Arthur, unlock the car." "I can't impose," I said, backing away. "You've already fed me. I have a place to go." It was a lie and a bad one. Extensive thunder cracked overhead, shaking the pavement beneath my sneakers. Arthur pulled their beat-up station wagon to the curb and rolled down the window. "Get in, Elena. Even the ducks are taking cover today." I got in. I told myself it was just for the ride, just until the rain stopped. Their house was a small, brick bungalow with ivy climbing the chimney and a porch swing that looked like it had seen better days. Inside, it smelled of lemon polish and old paper. Martha led me to a guest room at the back of the hall. "It's not the Ritz," she said, smoothing a quilt that looked handmade. "But the sheets are clean and the heater works." I stood in the center of the room, dripping wet, afraid to touch anything. "I can pay you back," I whispered, "as soon as the bank opens and I can get my deposit money." "Hush," Martha said, placing a fluffy towel on the bed. "Take a shower. We'll talk about logistics later." That night, I slept for 12 hours straight. I woke up expecting to be yelled at for oversleeping, for wasting the day, for being lazy, the usual morning soundtrack of my life. Instead, I woke to the smell of bacon. I packed my bag, fully intending to leave. I walked into the kitchen, my thank you speech rehearsed. "Good morning," Arthur beamed from the table, a crossword puzzle in front of him. "Martha says you like scrambled eggs. Hope that's all right." I have to go," I said, gripping the strap of my bag. "I've overstayed." Martha turned from the stove, spatula in hand. "Nonsense. The weatherman says this storm is stalled over the county for another 2 days. You're not going anywhere." One night became two. Two became a week. The transition wasn't sudden. It was a slow, terrifying thaw. I was constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. I apologized for everything. I apologized for using the hot water. I apologized for taking up space on the couch. I apologized when I sneezed. On the fourth night, after dinner, I automatically stood up to clear the table and wash the dishes, just as I had done every night of my life for my parents and Bianca. Arthur gently took the plate from my hand. "Elena, sit down, you're a guest." "But I have to earn my keep," I said, panic rising in my chest. "I have to be useful." Martha stopped wiping the counter. She looked at Arthur, then at me, her expression shifting from confusion to heartbreak. "Honey," she said softly, "you don't have to earn a seat at this table. You just have to be here." They started asking me questions that confused me. "How was your sleep? What kind of books do you like? What do you want to be?" "I'm a drafter," I told them one evening. "But I want to be an architect. I want to build houses that don't fall down." "Then you will," Arthur said, slamming his hand on the table with conviction. "You've got the mind for it, I can tell." It was the first time anyone had ever told me I was capable of something other than servitude. In that cluttered, warm kitchen, the ice around my heart began to crack. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was being seen. The years didn't pass in a blur. They passed in a steady, rhythmic climb. The guest room became my room, the walls painted a soft sage green that I chose myself. The temporary stay became permanent. I went back to school, finishing my degree not with the desperate exhaustion of a girl working 2 jobs to support a sister, but with the focused intensity of a woman supported by 2 people who actually believed in her. I remember the day I made senior architect. I stood in the firm's glass-walled office, holding the promotion letter, my hands trembling. Old habits die hard. My first thought wasn't celebration, it was defense. I instinctively calculated how much of the raise I would have to hide, how much I would have to lend to a sister who would never pay it back. Then I remembered. I didn't live in that house anymore. I drove home to the brick bungalow with the ivy and walked into the kitchen. "I got it," I said, dropping my bag. "I'm the lead on the Skyline project." Arthur didn't ask about the salary. He didn't ask for a loan. He dropped his crossword puzzle, stood up with a grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and yelled, "Martha, get the sparkling juice. Our girl is building the city." We celebrated with a $10 lasagna and plastic champagne flutes, and for the first time, the success felt entirely mine. Then came Julian. He was a landscape architect I met on a site visit, with kindness in his eyes and dirt on his boots. When I brought him home for the first time, I was terrified. My biological father used to tear apart any boy who looked at me, finding flaws just to exert control. I spent the entire car ride warning Julian. "Arthur asks a lot of questions. Martha might try to feed you too much." But when we walked through the door, there was no interrogation. There was just warmth. Arthur shook Julian's hand and immediately started talking about his tomato plants. Martha hugged him like he was a long-lost nephew. They didn't care about his pedigree or his bank account. They only cared that he looked at me like I was the son. Yet the trauma lingered like a ghost in the hallway. I kept waiting for the bill. I kept waiting for the moment they would realize I wasn't worth the effort. It happened on a Tuesday. I was exhausted, carrying a stack of blueprints, and I knocked over a vase in the hallway. It was an antique, something Martha had inherited from her grandmother. It shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I froze. The old fear seized my throat, choking me. I dropped to my knees, frantically gathering the shards, cutting my fingers. "I'm so sorry," I babbled, tears streaming down my face. "I'll pay for it. I promise I'll write a check right now. Please don't be mad, I'll fix it." I expected shouting. I expected the cold silence of the one-daughter ultimatum. Instead, warm hands covered mine. Martha knelt beside me, ignoring the blood on my fingertip. "Alina, stop," she said firmly. "I'm sorry," I sobbed. "I'm so clumsy, I'm worthless." "It's a vase," Martha said, pulling my hands away from the glass. "It's just a thing. You are my daughter. We don't trade daughters for porcelain in this house." She bandaged my hand and made me tea. And slowly, finally, the waiting stopped. I realized the other shoe wasn't going to drop, because in this house, nobody was keeping score. Christmas had always been a performance in the Thatcher house. It was a season of perfectly staged photos, expensive gifts that were really just bribes for affection, and the crushing anxiety of buying something good enough for my mother to avoid a passive-aggressive comment. But Christmas with Arthur and Martha was quiet. It smelled of cinnamon rolls and fresh pine, not desperation. We sat in the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth. I was 29 now, but sitting cross-legged on the rug in my pajamas, I felt like a child for the first time in my life. I had already opened my main gift, a vintage drafting set that Arthur had found at an estate sale, and I was content just watching the lights blink on the tree. "One more," Arthur said, reaching behind the tree. He pulled out a large, flat manila envelope. It wasn't wrapped in festive paper, it just had a red bow stuck to the front. He handed it to me with a trembling hand, then sat back down next to Martha, gripping her hand tight. "We talked about this for a long time," Martha said, her voice unusually thick. "We didn't want to overstep, but, well, open it." I slid my finger under the flap, expecting perhaps a savings bond or maybe the deed to the old car they insisted I take. I pulled out a stack of thick, legal documents. My eyes scanned the top page, petition for adult adoption. The world stopped spinning. The fire ceased to crackle. All I could hear was the rushing of blood in my ears. I looked down at the lines of text, the legal jargon that boiled down to one simple, earth-shattering promise. Arthur and Martha Evans wished to adopt Alina Thatcher as their lawful child. I looked up, my vision blurring. "We know you're grown," Arthur said, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't need parents to raise you anymore. You've done a fine job of that yourself, but everyone needs a place to land. Everyone needs a home that's theirs by law, not just by luck." "We want you to have our name," Martha whispered, wiping her eyes. "If you want it." I looked at the name Thatcher typed on the document. It was a name that meant debt. It meant servitude. It meant a door slamming in the rain. It was a name I had carried like a heavy stone backpack for 29 years, weighing me down with the expectation of failure. Then I looked at Evans. It was the name on the mailbox that had never turned me away. It was the name of the people who bought me muffins when I was starving and bandaged my hands when I broke their heirlooms. "You want to adopt me?" I choked out, the sob finally breaking free from my chest. "We chose you 7 years ago," Arthur said. "We just want the government to know about it." I didn't just cry, I wept. I wept for the little girl who thought she was unlovable. I wept for the teenager who worked 2 jobs to buy affection. And I wept with relief because I finally knew, with absolute certainty, that I would never be kicked out again. Arthur handed me a pen. My hand shook as I brought the tip to the paper. I didn't hesitate. I signed the line where the daughter's signature belonged. In that moment, Alina Thatcher ceased to exist. She was the ghost of a sad story. I was Alina Evans, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I belonged. The engagement was quiet, just Julian and me on a cliffside in Newport, but the announcement was loud. Julian, in his excitement, posted a photo of us, the diamond on my finger catching the late afternoon sun like a beacon. He tagged his firm, he tagged the location, and he tagged me, Alina Evans. I didn't think much of it. My social media was locked down tight, a fortress built against the past. But Julian's profile was public, a necessity for his business. And in the digital age, walls are thinner than we think. It started with a comment from Mrs. Gable, the nosy neighbor who used to watch me mow my parents' lawn while Bianca sunbathed. "Is that little Alina? My goodness, look at that ring." That single comment was the thread that unraveled 7 years of silence. I can only imagine the scene in the house I was kicked out of. I imagine Mrs. Gable calling my mother, feigning congratulations while actually delivering poison. I imagine Bianca, perhaps still living in that childhood bedroom or bouncing between failed attempts at adulthood, grabbing the phone to look. And I imagine Walter. I imagine him squinting at the screen, not looking at the joy on my face, a joy he never cultivated, but at the ring. It was a vintage piece from Julian's grandmother, heavy with history and value. It screamed stability, it screamed wealth. For 7 years, I had been a ghost to them. I was the shameful secret, the daughter who ran away, as I later learned they told people. I was supposed to be struggling. I was supposed to be destitute, serving as a cautionary tale for Bianca. I was supposed to eventually crawl back, begging for forgiveness, proving that I couldn't survive without Walter's protection. But the woman in the photo wasn't struggling. She was glowing. She was a senior architect. She was draped in a coat I bought with my own money, held by a man who looked at her like she was the only person in the world. The first ping came at 11:00 p.m. on a Tuesday. It wasn't a text. It was a LinkedIn notification. "Walter Thatcher viewed your profile." My stomach turned over. He wasn't looking for his daughter. He was assessing an asset. He was seeing senior partner. He was seeing the awards. He was doing the math. Then came the friend request on Facebook from Bianca. No message, just the request. Then a text to my old number, which I had kept, mostly out of a subconscious desire to leave a channel open, or perhaps just oversight. Unknown number, saw the news. "Congratulations, we should catch up. Dad misses you." It was Bianca. I knew her texting style anywhere, lowercase, casual, completely ignoring the fact that she had watched me get thrown out into the rain without lifting a finger. "Dad misses you." He didn't miss me. He missed the control. He missed the utility. He saw that the stock he had sold for pennies was now trading high, and he wanted his dividends. He saw a daughter who was marrying into a world he had always desperately wanted to be part of but never could afford. I sat in the living room of the bungalow, showing the text to Arthur. He put on his reading glasses, frowned, and handed the phone back to me. "People like that don't change, Alina," he said, his voice sad but steady. "They just change their tactics." I deleted the text. I blocked the number. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I had made my position clear by not engaging. I didn't realize that to a man like Walter Thatcher, silence wasn't a rejection. It was just a negotiation strategy. He didn't want to catch up. He wanted to claim his finder's fee. And he wasn't going to let a little thing like 7 years of abandonment stop him from taking credit for the woman he had tried to destroy. The morning of my wedding was a kaleidoscope of champagne toasts and hairspray. I sat in the bridal suite of the Vineyard estate, staring at my reflection in the vintage vanity mirror. The woman looking back at me wasn't the shivering girl who had slept in a bus station 7 years ago. She was someone new. My long, dark hair was parted in the middle, cascading down my shoulders in loose, natural waves that caught the light. My skin, usually pale with exhaustion in those early years, glowed with a fair to olive warmth against the ivory silk of my robe. My eyes, dark brown and expressive, were lined with waterproof mascara just in case. I looked steady. I looked whole. Martha was behind me, fastening a pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother. "You look breathtaking, Alina," she whispered, her eyes meeting mine in the glass. "Arthur is packing outside. I think he's more nervous than you are." I laughed, a sound that felt light and free. "He's terrified of stepping on my train." He's terrified of giving you away, Martha corrected gently. He says it's the hardest thing he's ever had to do. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. It wasn't the rhythmic, excited knock of a bridesmaid. It was the heavy, authoritative knock of security. The room went silent. Martha's hands stilled on my shoulders. "Come in," I called out, my voice steady despite the sudden chill in my chest. The head of security, a large man named David whom Julian had hired specifically for his discretion, stepped inside. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Ms. Evans," he said, using my legal name. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but we have a situation at the main gate." I knew, before he even said the name, I knew. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Who is it?" "A man claiming to be your father," David said. "He's insistent. He's wearing a tuxedo. He says he has a father's right to be here. He's threatening to cause a scene if we don't let him in to perform his duties." His duties? The audacity stole the breath from my lungs. The man who had locked me out in the rain, who had told me I was no longer his daughter, had put on a tuxedo and driven here to play the role of the loving patriarch. He wanted the photo op. He wanted the credit for the masterpiece he had tried to destroy. "I can have the police remove him," David said quickly, seeing the color drain from my face. "Just say the word and he's gone. You won't even have to see him." Martha gripped my shoulder tight, a silent anchor. "Elena, you don't have to do this. We can handle it." I looked at myself in the mirror again. I looked at the dark waves of my hair, the set of my jaw, the fire in my eyes. I thought about the $15,000 he had tried to steal. I thought about the one-daughter comment. I thought about the 7 years of silence. If I sent him away, he would spend the rest of his life playing the victim. He would tell everyone I was the ungrateful child who turned her back on her poor father. He would never know the truth of what I had become. "No," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. David paused. "No." "Let him in," I said. I stood up, the silk robes swishing around my legs. "Don't bring him to the family holding room. Seat him in the back row, but let him in." "Elena," Martha warned, "he's going to try something." "I know," I said, turning to face her. "I want him to see it. I want him to see you. I want him to see Arthur. And I want him to realize exactly what one daughter looks like when she's standing tall." I turned back to David. "Open the gate." The string quartet began to play, a soft, swelling melody that drifted through the rows of grapevines. The air smelled of jasmine and late summer heat. I stood at the top of the aisle, my hand tucked securely into the crook of Arthur's arm. He was trembling slightly, his other hand patting mine with a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. "Ready, daughter," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Ready, Dad," I whispered back. We took the first step. The guests rose to their feet, a sea of smiling faces turning toward us. I saw Martha in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I saw Julian at the altar, looking at me with a reverence that made my knees weak. For a fleeting second, the world was perfect. The past was a ghost that couldn't touch me here. Then, just as we passed the back row of chairs, a shadow detached itself from the crowd. It wasn't a guest stepping out to snap a photo. It was a blockade. Walter stepped into the center of the aisle, planting his feet wide in a stance of absolute ownership. He was wearing a tuxedo that looked slightly too tight across the shoulders, likely rented that morning. He didn't look at Arthur. He didn't look at the confused guests who began to murmur. He looked only at me. He was smiling. It wasn't a smile of pride or love. It was the arrogant, self-satisfied smirk of a man who believes he is doing the world a favor simply by showing up. He crooked his right elbow, offering it to me, effectively cutting Arthur off. "You look good, kiddo," Walter said, his voice booming in the sudden silence of the garden. "Let's get this show on the road." I stopped dead. The sudden halt nearly pulled Arthur off balance. The music faltered and died away as the musicians realized something was wrong. A collective gasp rippled through the audience, the sound of 100 people holding their breath at once. My reaction was visceral. My mouth fell open, a small gasp escaping my lips. My eyes went wide, staring at him in total, paralyzing disbelief. This was the moment, the exact expression captured in the thumbnail of my life. I was frozen in the absurdity of it. The man who had thrown me out like garbage, who had told me I didn't exist to him anymore, was standing here expecting to be honored. He truly believed that biology gave him a lifetime pass to my glory, regardless of his absence during my struggle. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from my arm, expecting me to instinctively detach from Arthur and cling to him. He expected the obedient daughter, the one who fixed things, the one who listened. "Come on, Alina," he urged, his smile faltering just a fraction as the silence stretched on. "Don't make a scene. Don't make a scene." Those words were the spark. They were the same words he had used when he told me to pay Bianca's debt. They were the words he used to silence me for 22 years. The shock in my chest didn't dissolve, it hardened. It crystallized into cold, unbreakable steel. I looked at his hand, the hand that had locked the deadbolt, and then I looked up into his eyes. I wasn't the girl on the porch anymore, and I wasn't going to let him steal this walk. I slowly closed my mouth. I squared my shoulders. And for the first time in my life, I looked at my father not with fear, but with pity. "You're in my way," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the pin-drop silence of the garden, it carried like a bell. Walter's smile faltered, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Alina, don't be dramatic. Everyone is watching. Take my arm." He reached for me again, his fingers grazing the silk of my sleeve. I didn't flinch this time. I took a deliberate step back, tightening my grip on Arthur's arm until I felt the steady, reassuring pulse of his wrist against my own. "I'm not being dramatic, Walter. I'm being accurate." I looked him dead in the eye, channeling every ounce of the cold indifference he had shown me on that porch 7 years ago. "You said it yourself. You only have one daughter." He blinked, the color rising in his cheeks. That was a long time ago. Families fight. We move on." "You didn't fight," I corrected him, my voice turning to ice. "You discarded. You looked me in the eye and told me I didn't exist unless I was useful to you. You said you only had one daughter, the one who listens, the one who pays." I gestured to the empty space beside him. "Well, she's not here. That daughter died in a bus station the night you locked the door. You killed her." A murmur rippled through the guests. Walter looked around, suddenly realizing that his tuxedo and his entitlement weren't enough to shield him from the truth. He looked small. He looked pathetic. "I am your father," he hissed, desperate now, dropping the benevolent act. "I gave you life." "And then you took it away," I said. I turned my head slightly, resting my cheek against Arthur's shoulder. "This man gave me my life back." Walter's jaw tightened, and for a second, I saw the old rage flare in his eyes. He stepped forward as if to physically pull me away from Arthur. But Arthur, the man who spent his days tending to tomatoes and solving crosswords, stepped in front of me. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a fist. He simply stood there, an immovable wall of tweed and love. "I think you should leave," Arthur said. His voice was low, devoid of malice but heavy with authority. "I'll take it from here." "You can't steal my daughter," Walter spat. "I didn't steal her," Arthur replied calmly. "I adopted her, look it up. It's a matter of public record." David, the head of security, materialized at Walter's elbow. He didn't say a word. He just placed a heavy hand on Walter's shoulder and pointed toward the exit. Walter looked at me one last time, waiting for me to crack, waiting for the guilt to work. I just smiled. It wasn't a triumphant smile. It was a peaceful one. "Goodbye, Walter." He was escorted away, his shoes crunching on the gravel, a discordant note fading into the distance. The tension in the garden broke, replaced by a collective exhale. Arthur looked down at me, his eyes shining with tears. "You okay, kiddo?" "I am," I said, and I meant it. The string quartet, sensing the shift, began to play again, a joyous, swelling crescendo. Arthur patted my hand, straightened his tie, and we began to walk. As we moved down the aisle, past the faces of friends who knew my story, past Martha, who was beaming through her tears, and toward Julian, who was looking at me with absolute adoration, I realized something profound. For years, I thought Arthur and Martha had saved me. I thought I was a charity case they had taken pity on in a diner. But as I walked toward my future, holding tight to the father who had earned his title, I realized the truth. They hadn't just saved me. They had seen me, broken, messy, and empty, and they had decided I was worth keeping. I wasn't a rescue. I was chosen, and that made all the difference.